Alright, so this is Sprint 7. Let's go over the bad news first. Well, two pieces of bad news. The first bad news is that the game side, on the schedule for this week, we had level 2 as our goal. We did not meet that, so we are behind on schedule for that. On the particle system side, we are technically on track, and that technically has an asterisk a mile wide, because, as I mentioned last week, the animated sprite does not has a bit of an issue with it. The issue is that the animated sprite works fine for our Draconis sprite, which is for the HUD. However, our particles are 3D objects within this scene. So, we can't apply Draconis sprite to a 3D object. Because, again, it's a 2D image on the HUD. The billboarding uses the graphics object texture flat. The problem here is that the graphics object texture flat takes a texture, whereas the sprite takes an image, and then, an image is basically a texture, but you take a portion of it. But I was searching through and I couldn't find a way to create a smaller version of a texture from another texture. How to basically make a rectangle of the texture and store it within the texture manager. So there's no way to slice up a sprite sheet, store those slices in the texture manager for the graphics object texture flat to use. Meaning that the only way we can get animation is if we store the slices within the image manager, but all images are 2D, as I have proven with this little 3D sprite test. I create a sprite, which can take an image and a rectangle. These values are set up so that it takes the first quote-unquote image from the sprite sheet. So this is set up, and then I try to rotate along the y-axis. Which, with the normal sprites only work in the x, z, so if we rotate along the y, we get an assert error. We get an assert error that the camera is supposed to be orthographic, so we can't draw. If we draw to the 2D camera, we also get an assert error. So there is no way to slice up a texture, to store those as textures, meaning we have to store them as images, and if we store them as images, they're 2D, so basically, we cannot have, at the moment, we do not have animated sprites for our particle system. The animated sprites still work, as shown last week, but this is going to be a work in progress. I'm definitely going to be talking about this with you tomorrow, or technically today, later. So that was a very big setback. I only realized that as I was putting the final touches on my particle system, which is why I don't have any work with the level, since this basically took all day trying to figure out a way to get around it, but nope, nothing. Not yet. I will find a way to make this work. So, going into the particle system, this completely works. We had to replace the animation with a graphics object texture flat, so we only have one image, but it still works. Everything still works. I'll demonstrate it later on since I have one set up. As I mentioned in my design document, the particle effect is the database for each effect. So we have, how long do emitters live? How long do particles, or technically bursts, live? What are the speed of the particles, the range? What's the range of particles for every burst? How often do bursts happen? It has every bit of information here. Currently, we have a very simple constructor that the user will use. Later on, I might add one that has, all of these options lined up, so scale start, or float scale start equals 1, and then repeat it for every single one. But I'm not sure if that's bad coding practice or not. So currently, I just have this initial setup, and then these are all public, since I want the user to both edit and have access to these. They're all public right now, so the user will just create it, and then they can edit these as they want. Maybe I'll add on that constructor later. So it has all of the information for the emitters and bursts to use. It has our constructor here, the destructor too, and then we have spawn emitter and stop all emitters. Stop emitters hasn't been implemented yet. That's part of the one level up the particle system in order to stop certain effects from, working in order to have them all work in tandem. But that'll be next week. Spawn emitter is basically just creating an emitter and then giving it back to the user. We're giving it to the user for a couple of reasons. One, because we have a ton of set functions for just everything, really. These set functions, very quickly, set functions replace. So set position, it'll snap to that new position. Set velocity, it'll snap to that new velocity. Change info, however, is a bit different. So for the position, if you add in 0, 1, 0, it'll add that onto the current position. So it'll basically move it up 0, 1, 0, in case the user wants to do that. I have these functions so that the user can basically say, okay, go away. Basically say, okay, I have my player. I'm going to create this particle effect, I'm going to create an emitter, and then every update I'm going to have that emitter set its position to my player position, so it can have those emitters follow along with the player. So that's the goal there. The spawn burst creates a burst, stop spawning. Oh, that will be in the future, as I mentioned before. We have our draw 2D, which I will talk about in a moment, our alarms, register, all that fun stuff. We have a few stuff to store. We have a pointer to our parent, the particle effect, and we have a list of bursts. We have a list. Originally I was going to use a vector, however I ended up using a list for one reason. The documentation for the vector mentioned that the only way to easily remove from a vector is from the end of the vector. And with the list, we are going to be removing from the front of the vector, or of the list, since we push it in at the end, and then we check the first, whenever every draw, we check the first burst to see, okay, has its time expired? Because they all have a lifetime. And then we remove it from the first. So if removing from the first is going to be inefficient, I'd rather not use it, so I switched over to the list. That's basically why I'm using lists instead of vectors. They're both scalable though, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So here it is, draw 2D. The reason I'm using draw 2D is that when we use the regular draw function, I noticed that the particles were only showing up occasionally. They would show up in front of the player, in front of the blank skybox, but the terrain was hiding them. So I assumed it's because they were being drawn and then the terrain was being drawn. And when I put it in draw 2D, I find out I'm correct. So that leaves me a couple of options. Either I can make a draw particle systems so that this doesn't happen, or I can just keep it in draw 2D and have it maybe draw itself over the UI, which will not look pretty. So I'll probably be implementing a draw particle systems in addition to draw and draw 2D, but who knows. So that was exciting. Currently this fixes it so that it works, but in the future this will definitely have to change. I'm not going to go too deep into this. Basically, we have all of our set functions down here. Spawning a burst, we have our burst factory, emitter factory, all of that set up. We're using factories so that things don't have to constantly be new and delete and all that. We're using a lot of rand functions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to static cast float a lot with them because rand, for some reason, returns an integer. So we have to static cast float if we want to get random float values. Thanks, that's convenient. But other than that, little gripe, everything's fairly normal. Register, submit draw registration is called by the factory when it's being created, and then when it realizes it's time to die, which is right here, deregisters itself, calls a recycle on itself, and tells the particle, hey, I'm done. So going over to the bursts, we have a much simpler class. Again, we have a pointer to the particle effect, array of particles, some information, set function, draw function, time left, which is public so that the emitter can edit it when it checks for, okay, are you supposed to be dead or not? The vector, this is all of the billboarding code from before that we did a while back. We have a lot of setup. Each particle creation has quite a lot going on, unfortunately. This is all random, though. All calls to rand, static cast float, and then rand max, just to make it random floats and stuff. There might be a way to make this easier, but I'm not exactly sure. I could make it so that each burst has the same random values, but that seems kind of eh. So currently this is how it is, but it works fine at the moment. And then we have time manager calls, yada yada, particle effects. They also scale themselves with time. So yeah, I'm just gonna stop talking about the grand overview and just show you. So currently my player actually I'm going to show you before we get in that. So currently the player is in charge of the first particle effect. That's because I just decided that. I don't know. So we have a new particle effect. We spawn an emitter at just slightly above us, basically, and we give it a upwards velocity so that the emitter is slowly going to rise up. We set the scale to be quite big at the first, and then we set a sprite rotation. So the sprites will, some of the sprites will slowly rotate, others will not rotate, and there you go. We're using a simple raindrop texture. As you can see, the emitter is slowly moving up, spawning these bursts, and they're slowly drifting out in various directions. And if we want to change any of the values, we can do that. So yes, I would like to edit. We can change, for example, what gravity we're using. We set up the gravity when we create the particle effect here. So you see sprite and gravity. Gravity is -1. Okay, well, that seems fine. Let's change the minimum speed. Min speed equals 5. Sure. The max speed is also 5, so this means that all of the particles will have the same speed to them. So if we look, yep, the particles do seem to be moving quite a bit faster now. Currently, you'll also notice that the particles are being wiped out instantly. Maybe they don't want that. Maybe we'll find out a way. But the particle system did also give me a bit of trouble with both transparency, so making the textures slowly fade out or something, and then color, so color shifting them. Those will maybe be added on later, but currently this is my particle system. We can make effects. It works.